Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels, and sometimes I talk about normal books or even self-help books, because, we can't always just be the weird. We have to focus on, a wide variety of literature on this channel, which is probably just an excuse I'm making to talk about the book that I'm talking about today. It is a book about belonging and vulnerability. I am referring to Braving the Wilderness by Brené Brown, which was published in 2017. For those who don't know, Brené Brown is a psychologist, a researcher studying mostly cognitive psychology, I would say, or more like an extension of that cognitive psychology and into the environment around people. She often focuses on, as I mentioned before, belonging, vulnerability, courage, connectedness, and a whole host of other topics. I'm very familiar with her because I have a degree in psychology, so her work was constantly popping up throughout my 4 years of my undergrad, and I heard quite a bit about her, and I've also watched her TED Talks, and she's really got her research out there, I think, because she's talking about a lot of very human topics like empathy and belonging, which you see people talk about in on podcasts or videos or whatnot, or like she even has her own like Netflix kind of TV show special, which is very interesting. She teaches at a university in Texas, and what's also important is that she's very willing to acknowledge her own, what I'd say is frailty, her own like insecurities and whatnot, noting that like there's a lot that she has to work on, and like being vulnerable and being truly out there is difficult, which I appreciate. She's not simply saying that this is easy or that anyone can do it. It takes time to work on these skills. Which is something that'll pop up as I'm talking about this book a little bit. Yeah, so Brené Brown is a very interesting researcher and probably one of the better known psychologists out there, along with Marsha Linehan, who created dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, which is most frequently used especially with people who have issues with emotional regulation. But without further ado, let's talk about Braving the Wilderness. I will do a brief summary, a little bit of an analysis, and we will move on from there. So Braving the Wilderness focuses primarily on Brené Brown's research. She does talk a little bit about herself in the beginning of not feeling like she belonged in her youth, largely due to the fact that her parents moved around. And when her parents finally stayed still for long enough, when they finally decided to move to Texas, they started having marital disputes, like things weren't going well in their marriage, and so things kind of became hostile in the Brené Brown household when she was a teenager, and she turned to drinking, drugs, doing extreme behavior, mainly to get noticed, but also because she wasn't comfortable in her own skin. She wasn't making friends at school, and she didn't feel like she belonged anywhere, and her family life wasn't helping much. And this continued much until her late 20s, when she finally met her husband, Steve, and they found that they had a lot in common, and they were willing to invest in one another, which produced a successful relationship and led to a marriage for her. But despite this marriage and this family that she's cultivated, she still feels lonely. She says she still feels like she doesn't have that place of belonging at times. But as she further notes, like she talks about like a Maya Angelou quote where like you belong everywhere and you belong nowhere, and that's okay. And Brené Brown's like, why is it okay to feel like you don't belong anywhere? Like that's not healthy. And at first she disagreed with Maya Angelou, but after she had met Maya Angelou, she really understood that like what that means is like you ultimately belong to yourself, and you have to be trusting in yourself and love yourself in order to truly belong, because you can be amongst a group, but unless you feel like you're comfortable in your own skin, you're never going to feel like you belong in this world. Brené Brown talks about true belonging, again, the idea of belonging to oneself and being willing to be vulnerable and braving the wilderness. She specifically talks about braving like the principles or the ideas that help make you feel more comfortable, such as setting boundaries, reliability, accountability, like an idea of the vault, where like you only share information that people need to know. You don't share information about someone else if they're not around. She talks about like integrity, non-judgmentalness, and generosity, which I like the idea of generosity being that like you assume the best in the others. You don't come into a conversation or something like that assuming that someone's out there or out to get you in some way, because that's going to make you feel more lonely. And then again, she talks about how like the political divide is growing every day, and this was written in 2017. So once Trump was elected, the political divide became like really apparent, and this has only contributed to more loneliness. And she kind of notes that it's weird that although we're like dividing ourselves among political boundaries, we don't find any comfort or sense of belonging in those political groups, and that's because they're not true groups. They're not actual representations of reality. It's just fictional like boundaries that we created, which just only contribute to our feelings of loneliness. And then she goes on to talk more about the dangers of anger and how that could be beneficial, but if you turn anger outwards and are only angry at other people, like you're going to get burnt out over time, and it's going to worsen your mental health in a lot of ways. She also goes on to talk about like the us versus them mentality, and especially the idea that like you're either with us or against us. And that's not really the case a lot of the time, because like there can be multiple mindsets. And she especially talks about how like someone told her like, oh, you're either with us with gun safety or you're with the NRA. And that's not how Brené Brown actually is. Like, she favors common sense gun control, but she's okay with practicing weapons and whatnot in a safe environment. And that us versus them mentality only leads to feelings of hostility in the end. And then she also goes on to talk about like civility, how like you need to treat people who like spread bullshit with in a civil nature, so as to not increase that divide and make it so that nobody feels like they don't belong, which I have a number of problems with, and I'll talk about in the analysis section. But then she also goes on to like talk about a spiritual connectedness with others, where like people in the same stadium can be singing a fight anthem of some sort, and that'll bring about spiritual connectedness, or singing a song in an arena at a concert, and like feeling connected to the other people and your own family in the process. And then she goes on to talk about the differences between like being in person and being on social media, and how you can still feel connected on social media, but there is a limit, because in person you can go for coffee, talk with someone, hold hands, bond in meaningful ways, which you can't necessarily do behind a computer, because you're just staring at a screen, and that's not the same as human connection. Whether or not that's true, I think I ultimately disagree with, but it's still a valid point. And then she ultimately talks about how the wilderness is necessary. The wilderness being that place where you're on your own and you're trying to cultivate like your inner being and grow and develop new opportunities and skills and really feel comfortable in your own skin. And like being out there is necessary. And you might try to like run away from it, but that's not going to help you in the end. And you might try to stop other people from being in the wilderness too long, but they need to be there for their own personal growth and whatnot. So ultimately she says you have to allow those people to be in the wilderness, because taking them out is kind of robbing them of those opportunities. And ultimately this is all about vulnerability, which she talks about in another book, but it's important to be vulnerable so that you can allow yourself to feel and be loved and open yourself so that you're in the present moment rather than feeling distant. In terms of analysis, Brené Brown does talk about a couple of good ideas here. One theme that she talks about in this book is self-belonging. The idea of belonging to oneself, which it sounds pretty obvious, like the idea of being comfortable in your own skin, or as she notes, the courage to stand alone and the courage to stand firm in who you are and not really back down, because we might be like someone might try to sway us one way or another, but being comfortable in who you are and not shying away or being afraid to expose yourself. Again, this is like vulnerability and being comfortable in showing that aspect of yourself and being able to be seen for all your flaws and all your weaknesses, because everyone has those. And if we're not comfortable with our flaws being shown, then we're never going to be truly comfortable in who we are, which I think is a great point by Brené Brown here. Like, in order to achieve this sense of self-belonging, we need to be vulnerable. We need to trust others and understand that that not everyone who we meet is going to try to hurt us in some way. That even though we might have had bad relationships in the past, that doesn't necessarily affect our future. And we also need to break down categories, because as human beings, we have a tendency to lump people into groups, and those groups don't have any basis in reality. And so it only stands to drag up a wall that divides us even further. And I do think there are a lot of good points there. But other times, sometimes those like categories that we create are actually helpful, because like you could set people aside into different categories, and the people in one category could be those that are actually trying to harm you. And I know we have to trust others, but sometimes like the past is a good indicator of what might happen in the future. Like if a certain group of people are behaving obnoxiously or harmfully or toxically towards you, like you wouldn't give them a chance in the future. Don't let them do that again. But maybe like trust only goes so far, as Brené Brown notes. So I'm sure she counts for that in her research. And ultimately, she says the results are great if you belong to oneself. Being vulnerable opens you up emotionally. It allows you to love more. It allows you to seek growth opportunities. It allows you to acquire new skills. It allows you to really feel like you belong in this world. Whereas if you have low self-belonging, if you aren't doing so well, like you're going to develop some negative mental health issues. I feel like suicide might be at the table in this situation, and it's going to be hard for you to find love or friendship or support networks if you aren't willing to give yourself out there. Which I appreciate, like Brené Brown talking about her own experience at the beginning of the story, because that really helps guide this entire sort of research that she's been doing. And it really feels relatable. Like, I have issues with being vulnerable sometimes, relating back to, like growing up, being made fun of a lot. And because I met like a good set of friends, both in college and when I moved to Washington and California, like I think that like that's helped me open up and understand and really understand the principles that Brené Brown is talking about. I'm sure anyone out there like who's listening to this might feel the same way, that they might currently even be kind of hiding that vulnerability, not willing to expose themselves in that way. And that's understandable, but like there's a need to do it because there's so many great things that could happen to you. And then she also talks about the wilderness, which is the idea that like it's a place where we go to be alone and to develop and work on those skills that allow us to feel like we belong. And maybe one day, like, or not one day, but like eventually we will return, because you can't be out in the wilderness forever. Like that, it's not healthy to be out there forever. Like you can go out there and return. It's like being introverted in many ways, but it's not completely like that. Like being alone is not the same as like being in the wilderness, because you can be in the wilderness and still know that you have a support system out there. And there's always an urge to return from the wilderness. Like you might want to rush back. But again, Brené Brown, as I noted before, like urges you not to rush back so quickly. Like, you have to be comfortable in your own skin again, and that's something you can only really do in the wilderness on your own, is by looking inward and seeing what's working well for you and what's not, and working on those areas that you need improvement in. Brené Brown also talks about the dangers of polarization, like how it's increasing the sense of, or it's decreasing the sense of belonging, and really taking us away from each other, even in our small communities, because we're turning against our neighbors, and that those are the people we often rely on for belonging. And I do think that she notes, like, there is an important need to call out bullshit. Like, anytime people are not representing reality in the objective way, we risk, like, moving further away from any form of objectiveness, of understanding the world as it is. And I believe, as I'm sure Brené does, that you can see the world objectively. In many ways, like, the world is a certain way, people are treated a certain way, like, there are values in our society that are objectively there, and people who try to say, oh, that's not true, or this isn't actually happening, those are either lying, or if they do it on a persistent basis, they're bullshitters, like Ted Cruz there. But she also notes that it's important to be civil in this case, where, like, if you call people out but you're too aggressive about it, that increases the divide again and gets us entrenched, and we risk alienating people and again hurting that sense of belonging. But my issue with this is that sometimes you can't really be civil. Like, sometimes the bullshitter is so entrenched in their own bullshitting in an effort to, I don't know, make money or increase their own power, that we can't, if we're civil about it, that allows them to get away with their behavior. And we have to call it out in aggressive forms when necessary. Like, do you think the Supreme Court justices are going to care if we're civil or not, if they're going to continue to take away rights? I don't think so. I think we have to be angry, and I think that's something that, like, Brené Brown understands but isn't ready to commit to, because, like, her research doesn't suggest this, but also this was in 2017, so Trump hadn't fully, like, committed to making things worse for everyone yet, as you would see by 2020. But still, like, maybe there is a need to be civil, but at the same time, we have to pick and choose our battles, and we have to choose when not to be civil. And I keep talking about anger in this way, and Brené Brown does say that anger isn't very helpful. Like, it can be for guiding us at times and being cathartic, but ultimately, like, it saps our strength. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. And it's critical to recognize that maintaining any level of rage, anger, or contempt, that favorite concoction of a little anger and a little disgust, over a long period of time is not sustainable. Anger is a catalyst. Holding on to it will make us exhausted and sick. Internalizing anger will take away our joy and spirit. Externalizing anger will make us less effective in our attempts to create change and forge connection. And I do think that Brené Brown has a point here, that holding on to that anger will make us tired and feel like we're at our end. Like, you know, so many years of the Trump presidency and continuing to be angry about the way that minorities are treated in America, as well as a whole host of other problems, it's left me feeling a little bit exhausted, and not nearly exhausted as the minorities in America who are dealing with this on a constant basis. But like, I feel like I need that anger in order to constantly fuel me to fight for these groups. But she says that, like, you can be mad, but you can choose to not be angry in the process. And I'm not really sure if that's possible. And ultimately, my question is, what does this mean if people are evil? If people go out of their way to make the world a worse place, like oil executives or Supreme Court justices or fascists or anything like that? Like, should we create an environment of belonging for them? Does this research still hold up in that case? And I don't think that's Brené Brown's, like, field right there. I don't think she's going that far, and even I think that I might be infusing some of the current flavor of the moment really into this research. But I still think that's important, because we do have to create welcoming environments for everyone, and allow everyone to feel welcome, and create situations where we're not alienating people. But sometimes you can't invite certain people to the party. I'm not trying to say like there's an in group or out group or anything like that, or maybe that is what I'm trying to say, but sometimes people are actively trying to harm others. And it's readily apparent, like militia groups or, anti-abortion activists. And so like inviting those people and trying to instill any sense of belonging and reaching across the aisle to help them, like that doesn't make the world a better place. That's not how an effective society runs, I don't think. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Braving the Wilderness by Brené Brown, a pretty interesting piece of self-help literature, I would say. I thought it was weird talking about a self-help book on this channel, but it is Brené Brown, and I feel like her research applies to a large part of the world, whether it be about empathy or trust or belonging or anything like that. And so I think I'm going to recommend it to you out there, but I will say it is pretty vague at times. It sometimes feels like I'm reading too much into her literature, and she's starting from a very like wide scoping place and doesn't really seem to get narrow or focused at all throughout this book. That's not to say it's bad. It's just I think this is maybe too wide scoping rather than narrow and exact for my taste. But I still recommend it. If you read this before or you simply want to talk about something I said here, definitely comment. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about Braving the Wilderness and Brené Brown if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and belonging travels. Farewell.